Sure. Thank you, Isabel. And Isabel is here too, helping. We'll both be active in the chat. So if you have any questions that come up, feel free to send us a message. If, we'll share any helpful links along the way. And our guest speaker for this evening is Martin Proulx. We're very excited to have him. And some of you might even know him. He's been a guest speaker for some of our previous courses. So this is very exciting. And let's see, additionally, we will have a quick worksheet that we'll be sending out at the end of this webinar. So if you have a chance to fill that out, Isabel will be sending it as well as a follow-up email, the recording, and the worksheet itself. As always, if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to us. And I will pass it over to Martin for his presentation.
Okay, sorry to jump in. Just want to make sure we all have our names displayed in the Zoom. Zoom sometimes changes your name to Zoom user or maybe a number, so make sure the name displayed is your name for attendance purposes.
Thank you for that, Isabel. All right, Martin.
Ready to rock and roll. Thank you, Madison. Thank you, Isabel. Good evening, everyone. Lots of familiar faces and lots of new faces. So I hope we can provide some good information for you this evening. As Madison said, my name is Martin Proulx. I am the value-added agricultural specialist with the Maryland Department of Agriculture. Through today's presentation, I'm going to tell you a little bit about that role and the responsibility here at the Department of Agriculture. But what I primarily want to provide for you today is sort of a top level, broad look at the regulatory framework in Maryland as it relates to processing value-added agricultural products. So that is taking a raw agricultural product and turning it into a finished food product one way or another. Obviously, taking a variety of products and projects and boiling them down into 10 slides is not going to get as specific as some of us want to. So please, if there are any topics or items that we talk about or discuss, please throw a question in the chat. We can pause and talk about it. And then we'll certainly save some time at the end to talk about any particular cases. I know when we do this for Chesapeake Ag Innovation Center courses, we usually have a small cohort of food businesses at various stages. I know that we've got even more industry involved this evening, so we will keep it very top level unless requests to get more specific on certain types of products. Otherwise, we can jump right in. And you're seeing my screen okay, Madison, Isabel? Thumbs up. Perfect. So just so everybody is familiar, because value-added agriculture is a very, very broad term, what we're talking about when we say value-added agriculture. Obviously, my capacity is a bit more expansive than just value-added agriculture in the eyes of taking a raw agricultural product and turning it into something a bit more premium. So just for your reference, value-added agriculture, which was once considered just that raw product, finished product, has expanded to incorporate a lot more ways to add value to a farmer's bottom line. That can include marketing value, distribution value, but one of the common ones we find ourselves engaged in very frequently is that experiential value through agritourism and other engagement activities. So for the sake of today, value-added agriculture, we're certainly going to focus on the food production side. But just so you're familiar, we can absolutely be a resource on many components of your agricultural enterprise as it expands into connecting with the public, understanding the regulatory framework as it relates to zoning and land use. Obviously, that would be about a 6-hour presentation if we added that layer. So we'll stick with value-added processing for this evening. In 2023, the Maryland General Assembly actually passed law that established this value-added agricultural specialist role within the Department of Agriculture. If you're familiar with the Maryland Department of Agriculture, it's primarily a regulatory agency. There is a marketing leg for promoting growers and businesses in the agricultural space, but Maryland Department of Agriculture has a lot of regulatory legs as it relates to animal health, plant and pesticide, food quality assurance, nutrient management and resource conservation. This role was created in 2023 to kind of establish that liaison between the business community and not just the Department of Agriculture, but all of these other agencies that are starting to touch this new and emerging trend of value-added agriculture and agritourism, which we'll get to as we go through the presentation. So when we talk about value-added processing, it's really important to just take a step back and really understand the tangled regulatory web. I believe that the title of this session was Cutting Regulatory Tape or Red Tape and Navigating Regulatory Framework. This presentation is not to convince you that it is not complicated. It can be very complicated, but what we want to do is really just kind of give you the steps for progressing through that regulatory roadmap and understand where to start, what questions to ask, what considerations to already take into account before you even start this journey. So first and foremost, right, the important questions before we even pick up the phone and start making phone calls and start planning out this business. Here are the important questions when we're talking about value-added agricultural products is understanding what is the product. I know that seems like a simple question, but there's a lot to consider. Not just what is the finished product that we want to sell or put on shelves or serve to customers, but what are the ingredients? What does it take to make that product? All of the steps, how are you going to store that product? It's really important to have a full vision of what it takes to get that product to market. Now, as we start this regulatory journey, we might learn a few things, but at the beginning, it's important to really have that full vision of what this product is and what you want it to be. One of the other important considerations is where you think you will be processing it. That is not just today, but that 10-year plan. Are we talking about scaling up a value-added enterprise? Are we trying to get our foot in the door? But it's important to understand what opportunities are available to you. So when I talk about the where, some of the three categories I'd like you to think about and be familiar with that might pertain to certain licenses or regulation that could apply to your business is that there may be opportunity for operating within a home residential kitchen. We'll talk about how that comes into play. Are you looking at building a facility, whether that is in town, on your farm operation? Are we looking at a completely new build for the sake of a processing facility? Or do you have access to an already licensed or permitted commercial kitchen space, whether that's commissary or a commercial kitchen space that has some availability to you for a smaller operation? And I think it's important to understand or be familiar with what timeline you would like to follow. Obviously, generating revenue is an important way for a business to scale up. So as we talk through these licenses and some of these considerations, it's important to know that some of these may be stepping stones to the final stage of a successful business enterprise. The production scale and quantity goes hand in hand with where you plan to process. And then also importantly is where and how do you intend on selling this product? We'll get a little complicated with some of these regulatory agencies and how they trickle down to affect you and your business. But it's important to know the difference between wholesale of products, making products to just go on shelves and be sold through distributors, or direct to consumer, whether that be smaller scale channels such as community farmers markets, or potentially direct food service, whether that's pop-ups or delivering food. So important considerations to jot down when you're planning this out. Again, just to take a step back, not to overwhelm you, but just to show you kind of what that regulatory framework looks like from the bottom up. You're obviously looking to operate within a jurisdiction, whether that's a municipality or a county in the state of Maryland. Each and every jurisdiction is going to have differing regulations and expectations as it relates to the making of food products and value-added agriculture. So it's important to understand that first and foremost, zoning and permitting is going to really be an important consideration of can you do what it is you plan to do in the jurisdiction you intend to do it. I also want to take the time to break out that when we say health department, that there's actually two regulatory layers to the health department that could theoretically both apply to what you're trying to do when it comes to a value-added enterprise. So when we talk about the health department, it's good to be familiar with the fact that there is the Maryland Department of Health at the state level and the Maryland Local Health Department, or local health departments within the state of Maryland. And those county health departments are often regulating state law, but there is some flexibility and, of course, differing interpretation when you go across multiple jurisdictions. So it's important to know that when we talk about processing, making a product, assumably for distribution and wholesale, we're looking at state licensing for production of products. But when we get down to the retail, the food service, you know, scooping ready-to-eat foods into bowls and at local farmers markets, or sampling, you may be experiencing some involvement from a local health department as well. So let's take a step up to the state. I had mentioned the Department of Health, and I had mentioned the fact that there is there's state licensing for value-added processing of products. So most of this is under the state scope, with the exception of meat and cheese, and we'll talk about that a bit more in a future slide. The Maryland Department of Health is broken into three offices specific. Well, the Maryland Department of Health is broken into many offices, but when we talk about food protection and the offices that are relevant to the value-added processing of agricultural products, specifically food products, there are three offices to be familiar with that we'll cover. But just again, to show you, we just talked about one concept, health department, and we have broken it into two layers and multiple offices. So bear with me as we run through that. Depending on the complexities of your product and also your involvement with raw agricultural products and sales of raw agricultural products, there may be differing federal agencies to be familiar with. So when we're talking about food production as a whole, Food and Drug Administration, the FDA at the federal level, will often have, if not any form of licensing, and in many cases there aren't necessarily formal licenses, but a lot of guidelines and standards that have to be followed as it relates to a variety of foods. And if we're not talking about finished value-added processed products, the USDA at the federal level often holds standards for the distribution and sale and tracking of raw agricultural products. So there's potentially additional certifications and requirements that might come into play regarding specific products, and we'll touch on that a little bit. But I don't always engage with groups that have a lot of representation on the meat processing side or the alcohol production side, but I'll just touch briefly on what that is. So the USDA at the federal level requires a federal grant of inspection for the further processing of meat products and, strangely enough, blue catfish. So if there's nobody engaging in the pasturage and raising of livestock to be processed offsite and then sold in freezers on the farm, or engaged in catfish processing, we don't have to dwell on the USDA Food Safety Inspection Service too heavy this evening. If we're talking about alcohol manufacturing, it's important to understand that even when we're talking about products that aren't necessarily alcohol heavy, I mentioned kombucha because when we talk about thresholds in future slides, it'll be important to know that one little change in an ingredient or one little change in a process can catapult the product into a completely different category. So for the sake of just alcohol manufacturing, it's important to know that there's federal oversight for the manufacturing of alcohol. There's some state involvement, which I'll mention here shortly, but the Federal Alcohol and Tobacco Tax and Trade Bureau is the licensing and permitting entity for alcohol manufacturing. I just got through the framework, so Madison, I'm going to run through some of these questions and see if any stand out to what were just asked. I do see some that can certainly be saved for a great engaging discussion towards the end here. But I just wanted to see if there was any about the comments. Why is the on-farm processing limited to meat and cheese? It's not. I'll explain that here shortly. So let me run through the local considerations, and I believe it's, let me just make sure, yes, the next slide, we will jump into the licensing and regulatory buckets, and I think that's where we'll probably have the most questions of who qualifies for what, where the thresholds are, and that's often where we find ourselves staying for a little while to discuss. But I just laid out the web of regulation that you need to be familiar with if we're just talking about the concept of processing value-added products. So when we talk about starting locally, again, I had alluded to the fact that there are important considerations to get out of the way prior to even pursuing appropriate licensure for the making any of these products. It's important to know that you have allies at the local level. There, in many jurisdictions, there are agricultural specialists within counties in Maryland. Across the 24 Maryland counties, to include Baltimore City, 13 of these jurisdictions have agricultural specialists at the county level. That's more than half the jurisdictions, and they're a wealth of knowledge. If your county specifically does not have an agricultural specific specialist, you have an economic development office, which is not a regulatory body, but a business support center that can guide you and help you understand the local considerations. And that's a really, really important place to start. This is the office to which you can approach with your vision. Again, these are not regulators. They can ask questions on your behalf. They can get clarity, and they can make sure you're asking the right questions for your local jurisdiction. These individuals in these offices can also help you by understanding the zoning and permitting. Again, this could be a whole separate presentation, but we know that we can only guide businesses through law as it exists today. We know that the framework's not perfect, and that's another part of my role in working with state agency and regulatory partners to try to improve that framework to make things easier for small and emerging businesses in the space. However, there's still a lot of complications that happen from the way state law trickles down locally, and you have to understand how your local jurisdiction regulates and recognizes not just agriculture, but these value-added agricultural activities. So it's important when you're finding these local offices and finding those business support resources to understand who to talk to locally and get a better understanding of if what you're trying to do fits the location to which you're trying to do it. So the important questions of zoning and permitting. We'll talk about the regulatory buckets and the licenses here shortly, but understanding if we get to the next slide and talk about the idea of potentially using a home kitchen, that does not mean that you can do that without any regard for local zoning and land use. It's important to understand how your jurisdiction regulates said activity. So some of the questions you'll be asking at the local level is whether or not you can do this product and this process at your home or your farm kitchen, whether or not you're trying to build a whole nother facility on the same parcel. There's going to be permitting requirements. There's going to be standards to understand. There could be additional permits for commercial construction if you're either outfitting an old agricultural building or building a new structure. With these economic development or agricultural development offices in your corner, it's also time to clarify what role your local health department may play. I had said earlier that when it comes to food service, that the local health department often plays a role in the retail side and the sampling side of your value-added products. It's also important to know that your local environmental health and your local health department also will play a role when it comes to potable water supply and appropriate wastewater disposal. So when plans are getting approved, not just for food processing, but just in general, your local health department is involved in making sure that the water source is appropriate, often requiring some form of potable water test. If we're talking about infrastructure construction, then we're potentially talking about perk tests for the sake of establishing septic fields, depending on what that wastewater and that waste disposal system would look like, depending on the scale to which we're looking to achieve. This is where we'll stay a little bit because this one can get a little complicated, but I think this is a really important slide to dwell on a little bit because it can really seem like licensure of food is very, very complicated. But when you boil it down at the state level, when we talk about taking food and taking raw agricultural products and turning it into a finished value added product, there's really three regulatory buckets at the state level to be familiar with. I call them regulatory buckets because the first one isn't even a license. It is basically an exemption that seems to be very popular, but I'll be honest, is a very, very thin threshold. So the Maryland Department of Health, again, has many programs and oversees a lot of things as it relates to public health and safety. But within the Maryland Department of Health, there's the Office of Food Protection, which is broken into three offices. One that does facility and process review. That's basically where you would be applying for a new license. There's the Office of Food Protection that oversees and inspects and renews licensure. And then if we're talking about any dairy products, the Office of Milk and Dairy Product Safety is a separate office that also does inspections and licensure. But for the sake of what these licenses look like, it's important to understand the Department of Health will be your starting point for the majority of value-added processing, with the exception of meat, catfish, and alcohol. So when we talk about these regulatory categories, I want to just jump on the idea of cottage food and cottage food law. Cottage food law is pretty simple in nature, but gets very complicated because of what it can be, and more importantly, what it can't be. So cottage food is the manufacturing of what is known as a potentially non-hazardous food in a home kitchen. A potentially non-hazardous food is very limited in definition. I was working in farmers markets several years back, and cottage food is really popular because cottage food has no regulatory oversight and allows some marketing channels such as farmers markets. At least 5 years ago, it has since expanded, and there's a lot more avenues to sell cottage food products. But one of the easiest examples is, chocolate chip cookies or brownie from Brownie Mix. Products that do not take, a lot of raw agricultural ingredients, products that don't have a very high moisture content. And there's even some ability under cottage food to repackage commercially processed goods. I think of blending teas, getting a bunch of different herbs or flour, any kind of floral product, and arranging herbal teas using a pre-commercially dried products. Seasonings as an example of something that might qualify under cottage food, as long as you're not drying your own agricultural products, but packaging, repackaging, or blending things that are already commercially packaged and prepared. So cottage food has had a long history. Again, I think I might have just let it slip, but traditionally cottage food was capped at a $25,000 annual revenue cap, with the limitation that the producer under cottage food law could only sell at farmers markets. It was a handful of years ago that legislation was passed to expand. It may have been pandemic related, that the cottage food law was expanded to allow the sales of these products beyond farmers markets, direct to consumer, online, and now there's a voluntary registration that would allow for a business to even sell to certain retailers. When I say cottage food's unregulated, there are disclaimers and labels that are required to be included on your product, and a home address to where this product is made is required. The reason the voluntary registration was created, not just for traceability standpoint, but the voluntary registration with the State Department of Health allows for a unique ID number to be assigned to the cottage business, which could be used on labels in place of a private resident address. So that is certainly a plus for registering the product, but that includes oversight and approvals of labels and recipes, etc. So cottage food with the expansion, again, $50,000 revenue cap in a year. which could certainly be good for businesses that qualify and are looking to scale up or maybe phase up a business. But it's important to know that when I say potentially non-hazardous, when we talk about a lot of the emerging value-added agricultural products, I think of a lot more products that would fall into either this next category or the last category. So cottage food, again, tied to a residential kitchen. The first license I want to talk about briefly is the on-farm home processing license. So the on-farm home processing license is theoretically the sweet spot for farm and agricultural producers growing their ingredients and then utilizing their home on-farm kitchen to make that value-added product. It goes beyond cottage food because it's an approved license. There are certain products that would not be allowed under cottage food that could be allowed to a farmer growing these ingredients and getting this license. So some of those examples, sauces, jams, jellies, and although some of those may qualify for cottage food based on pH level, it is very limited. Pickles are a real popular one that I see anecdotally when engaging with those under an on-farm home processing license. But there's also some products that are not necessarily processed on farm that can qualify for this license. One that I've been dealing with quite a lot recently, and that is the meat or the cheese where the raw product is raised on the farm. So either the livestock is raised on the farm or the milk is harvested on the farm, but that raw product is then transported to a USDA facility for the further processing into what we're calling, the frozen cut and wrap. So when we're talking meat, whether it be poultry, beef, lamb, pork, if you visited a farm in Maryland, you may have seen a beautiful frozen cut of beef with some labels on it that were packaged for that farm. That meant that farm raised the animals, took it to a licensed facility, and is now able to sell those cuts straight from the farm. The on-farm home processing license also encompasses those products. So I think those are the two regulatory buckets that could include a home kitchen. After that, we're looking at commercial. I like to air quote that. You'll get me on a soapbox if you ask too many questions about commercial versus agriculture. But when we talk about these two products or these two licenses for scaling up, it's important to know that these aren't necessarily a one-size-fits-all solution. The on-farm home processing license is actually revenue capped as well, less than cottage food at this moment in time. So the on-farm home processing license is actually a $40,000 revenue cap at this moment, with some proposed regulation coming down the pipeline to bring it on par with cottage food cap, while simultaneously removing the revenue cap for the meat and the cheese as to not limit the producer from being able to sell meat and cheese that's processed at a plant off-site. Anything that does not qualify within the two regulatory buckets that I just mentioned is going to fall into a catch-all processing license. That, again, air quote, is the commercial standard when we talk about the value-added processing. So that does not count for a home kitchen. That would require either the building and establishment of a new approved facility or utilizing an existing commercially licensed facility for the either commissary use or your specific use for the products which you're trying to enter into the market. So again, that's all other value-added products that aren't meat products or alcohol. That would include milk and dairy products. Dairy products are difficult to regulate sometimes. There is, again, the exception to the on-farm home processing license where you can ship your milk off-site and bring the finished cheese product back to the farm and sell it. But other than that, milk and dairy processing is going to fall under a commercial license as well. And then it's important to understand that even beyond this processing license, and when we talk about commercial standards, we're talking about appropriate septic, waste disposal, water source, water under pressure, you know, the kitchen standards that you're used to. And then there may be additional certifications and requirements as it relates to what your product is at the federal level. So we'll talk about it a little bit, but acidified foods is a term that's going to come up. Hot sauces, certain salad dressings. I know I had mentioned kombucha earlier as one of those things that you have to be careful with because of alcohol content. Some of those more sensitive products might require some certifications, and we'll talk about some courses and things that exist for anyone operating in that space. I don't know if I've mentioned as an example, but it's come up pretty commonly about some of these, what we consider to be more unique processes, especially smaller scale on the farm, that are not necessarily moisture intense. So I have engaged with a lot of farms that are growing artisanal grains, looking to mill that into a flour or value-added product of any kind, rolling oats. The further processing of products is requiring licensure. Must be very careful, regardless of how simple the concept seems. If a raw agricultural product is being changed in form, we need to have a conversation because state licensure is probably likely if you're looking at that kind of distribution model. I'm going to touch on these two other agencies to be familiar with, and then I do see some good questions that I'm absolutely available to jump into. The Department of Health obviously is going to be the starting point when we talk about regulation and understanding what licenses may be required for you as it comes, once we've done the due diligence at the local level, right? But it's important to know that there are other agencies that play a role. The Maryland Department of Environment is a really important one as it comes to, again, the approved potable water source, your waste and wastewater disposal. And if you are on doing processing on the farm, in this context, it would probably be a processing license on the farm in an outbuilding or another facility. There are creative solutions that could allow for wastewater to be land applied as a soil conditioner rather than requiring full-fledged waste disposal system installation. So wineries, breweries have been examples of this where, you know, that wastewater, which is mostly food waste, can be approved by MDA's state chemist office as a soil conditioner, can actually be land applied in your plans to be approved, which again takes away one of the more expensive investments when it comes to the wastewater disposal. I'll clarify, because this has come up a lot, is that this is wastewater from food processing, not food service. So that can get a little complicated as well. Ice cream is the example. Wastewater disposal wastewater could be land applied for the making of the ice cream on site, but the scooping of the ice cream is service or preparation wastewater that might require its own separate disposal. So things just be familiar with of how the service of food and the manufacturing of food can sometimes interact. Again, I haven't seen too much in the chat as it relates to alcohol production, so I won't dwell too. Zip by there. There we are. This is actually a recent switch. So up to about 8 months ago, this slide deck would have said the comptroller's office was responsible for licensing alcohol manufacturing at the state level. This responsibility has since shifted over to the Maryland Alcohol, Tobacco, and Cannabis Commission, the ATCC. So there are a number of state licenses that are far more specific to the product you are looking to make, an alcoholic product, than federal approval. At the federal level, you would be getting, as I said, you start there, you'd be getting approval to make alcohol, whether it's spirits, beer, or wine. Once you get approval at the federal level, you're getting your product and your license approved at the state level for a few different classes that exist. There are 2 classes for wineries and 2 classes for breweries. Each have a distinguished class license that can be specific to an agricultural operation. As of right now, the distillation of spirits is specific to 1 license. But when it comes to agricultural production, wineries and breweries do have classes specific to those using their own and local ingredients. Again, I haven't seen it pop up. So before I jump into Fed regs, I will look through some of these questions. Lots of familiar names and questions, so thank you. Gonna go way up here. So Shauna Henley asked, Martin, great report that came out last week. I'll plug that later. Thank you, Shauna. Do you think co-packers are underutilized for value added right now? Maybe I should have held on to this question, but I'm in too deep. So I think there's a scalability issue, and we'll probably have some time to talk about this entirely at the end of the conversation. I do think that co-packers are underutilized. I do also think that we as support service, as public servants, have not fleshed out the important considerations and information about preparing businesses to approach co-packers and explore some of these opportunities. When I keep saying scalability over and over, there's sometimes a big committing to certain co-packers, whether that is production size, years of service. It's not necessarily go and get one product run. Maryland does not have a ton of solutions in the co-packing space right now, but there are a few. The commissary and the shared kitchen spaces do seem to be trending upwards. Again, I could go on and on about that as well. From a business planning standpoint, there's some challenges with that and how it's regulated. When we talk about environmental health regulations and oversight, producers, makers of a product, are regulated based on the needs of that product specifically. So when we talk about multiple food service or food manufacturers sharing a space, it's hard to plan how many tenants we can accommodate or what that space needs to look like without having every single producer lined up, because someone who requires much more of a grease trap capacity could minimize the number of other vendors that could potentially participate in that space. So there are a lot of requirements as it comes to different foods and different requirements, but yes, absolutely. Again, I had sort of alluded to the in-home kitchen, and we know why that would be an attractive opportunity. There's not a lot of overhead costs with using your home kitchen, but obviously there's a lot of challenges with that as far as limitations. There's not a ton of products allowable under this. And of course, when we hear the term commercial kitchen, it can be intimidating because the term commercial as a whole can be intimidating, especially in the agricultural space and being regulated a bit more intensely than you would as a traditional agricultural operator. A lot of introductions. Why is the on-farm processing limited to meat and cheese? Lawan, I hope I expanded on that a little bit. The on-farm home processing is not meat and cheese, is actually just an accessory allowed product when it's not processed on site. Molly's asking, how do cottage foods, the non-farm products like baked goods, intersect with on-farm stands? Is that county by county? So again, this is where you're going to see actually a good example, right? That's the intersection of three regulatory bodies. So the cottage food falling under state, even though it's not formally licensed, that is the framework to which you're operating under. The state has disclaimers and rules for what cottage food can be and how it needs to be labeled. Then the idea of selling cottage food retail not only has local implications as far as environmental health and the sales of food products, but when you talk about farm stands and what I can only imagine is an inquiry about zoning and land use, there are a lot of jurisdictions that have different definitions for what we would consider to be on-farm sales, whether that's a farm market, farm stand, open air market. There's no universal definition for what some of these things look like. So it's really important to understand the local considerations for what this farm stand may allow you to do on your property. And then whether zoning even gets that specific as to whether or not a food product qualifies, or if this type of zoning and land use designation is specific to raw agricultural products only. Again, cottage food was very limited just a few years ago. It's still semi-limited, but there is a lot more expansion to how you can market and these sales channels. You used to not be able to sell this off of from your home kitchen, but in theory, you can sell it off of your property. I say in theory because once again, the added layer of local regulation and zoning and land use. So just making sure that the sales of these value-added products qualify as far as your county is concerned. Another question, Janice had a question. I'd like to start a freeze-dried business, freeze dryer in the house. Could include candy, but other products like mushrooms, fruit, vegetables. I live on a mini farm, but at the moment don't grow these items. Also want to sell online. So freeze drying seems to be a new trend, Janice. I believe the freeze drying of commercially processed products like candies may qualify. We'll have to have a follow-up, but there's freeze-dried candy corn in our communal office table over here. A little sweet for my taste, but looks cool and seems to be labeled appropriately. So I don't want to get anybody in trouble here. But as long as we're talking commercially processed goods, if you want to freeze dry raw agricultural products, we're talking about the further processing of a product that will require licensure. It is possible that on-farm home processing could qualify if you are growing those products. Otherwise, you'd be looking at a commercial processing license, which might require either, again, a commissary space or access to a commercial kitchen. Victor, there's a familiar name. We haven't connected yet. We've been playing phone tag. Can I touch on CBD and cannabis? I absolutely can touch on CBD and cannabis, probably cannabis less so. So CBD obviously is a product, a hemp-derived product that is becoming very popular. It is important to know that you have to be cautious when you're talking about CBD, especially as a consumable product, because CBD or THC, which would be the cannabis-derived product, are would consider a product adulterated currently. So the Maryland Department of Health, and I believe many other state departments of health, cannot recognize a CBD or THC-infused food product as an appropriate licensable good. So you're seeing a lot of the examples of supplements, and I think maybe it's actually on this slide, where the cosmetics and non-food products often have some form of guidelines and regulations, but there are not Maryland Department of Health food standards for those products. So it's a matter of what the intent of this product is and whether we're talking food product or whether we're talking supplement or health supplement of some sort. So the THC tinctures, obviously THC is a little bit more intensely regulated currently by the Maryland Cannabis Commission, but CBD products certainly seem to fall in that gray area right now. There is retail licensure for CBD products if you are looking to sell multiple users products, but as of right now, the cosmetics, the applications of ointments and balms fall under federal guidelines. That's under FDA. I don't know if there is a link at the end of this presentation. I think there might be. If not, I've been distributing. There's a FAQ for small business cosmetic manufacturers with the do's and don'ts. Beef tallow has come up a lot as another product that's often applied in cosmetic products, and that falls again in that tricky area. It's just really important to understand the thresholds. Question. I'd like to ask Claire, Keon, we know each other as well. I'd like to ask a clarifying question regarding eligibility. Although our fruit ingredients aren't currently sourced in Maryland, they're 100% U.S. grown. Since our company is regionally local and innovation, would we still meet the criteria for a Maryland value-added product, given that we align? So I think that question is more specific to a external program to today's discussion. But for those unfamiliar, you heard me allude to our marketing leg here at the department. I saw a familiar face. I think my colleague might be hiding in the audience. The Maryland Department of Agriculture has some programs and partnerships that promote Maryland grown and Maryland made products. Maryland's best is the umbrella. I believe what this inquiry is being qualified as a Maryland product for the sake of procurement. The Maryland Department of Agriculture partners with a few other state agencies as it relates to encouraging and growing procurement by Maryland institutions of locally made and grown products. This is called the Certified Local Farm and Fish Program, the CLFF. There are some barriers of entry to that program as it relates to sourcing ingredients that are not Maryland ingredients. As of right now, the CLFF is limited to individual farms that have nutrient management plans and are compliant with nutrient management law. If you're a producer of products that you are not necessarily growing, evidence that the ingredients are being sourced by compliant Maryland farms and compliant nutrient management plans are required right now for participation. I think that conversations continue to happen surrounding the expansion of some of these definitions, but at the moment in time, and this being a very early program, it was definitely a Maryland farmer first to encourage the sourcing. I certainly understand that when we talk about some of these value-added enterprises, I know that the fruit ingredients can be a difficult one because you need a more or less aseptic, commercially pasteurized fruit product. It's not necessarily always strawberries fresh from the patch. And that also is some middle supply chain challenges that Maryland is experiencing right now. So we always appreciate the input. We always appreciate the support of Maryland's businesses. So always happy to discuss and learn the needs of your operation. But as it relates to the program, and again, I think I'm talking about the right program, there are certainly some limitations, but we are getting inquiries from processors that are not necessarily using their own products, sourcing other ways. And the traceability of that has proven to be a little challenging, but one we're certainly happy to entertain. Lawan asked again, how about when you test your sweet potato pie and it passes the pH and water activity test? Why is it still not allowed for cottage? Sweet potato was recently added the last 5 years as hazardous. I haven't looked at that document in a little while, Juan. I'd have to follow up. If it's pH and water activity, that would be moisture content. I would still think a pie would have a moisture level that might cause challenges, but I'd be curious to learn more. I know even sweet potato bread does not qualify as it relates to moisture content. We didn't dwell on that too much, but when we talk about cottage food products and the baking of goods, you're looking at more crusty, hard loaves. Some of these sweet or moist breads, such as zucchini bread, sweet potato bread, pumpkin bread, also might be catapulted out of cottage food consideration. How about drying and creating spice blends? So, Heather, you would need to be utilizing pre-commercially dried products. If you are dehydrating your own herbs, that is the process that requires licensure. So it's important to know that the sourcing of ingredients becomes a really important piece of a lot of these conversations and a lot of these regulatory frameworks, in that the product needs to basically be commercially recognized. Therefore, you would need to be licensed to further dry that raw herb or spice. What about honey? Is this a cottage food item? Tasha, honey isn't even a cottage food item if we're talking about a raw honey. So raw honey is an agricultural product. There's no further licensing on raw, unadulterated honey. If you are adding flavor, whipping honey, turning that honey into some kind of cocktail mixer, or processing it any further, there is opportunity for an on-farm home processing license or a processing license. But if we're talking about just harvesting the honey and selling it in jars at a farmer's market or a farm stand, that is a raw agricultural product. There are federal standards for raw agricultural product. If you're talking small scale, there's a revenue cap. Don't quote me on this, but I think we're talking about $25,000 as it relates to the Food Safety Modernization Act and some of these standards as it comes to packaging and traceability. Honey would fall under that treatment of a raw agricultural product. think I ran through some of those questions. We didn't get a lot on the federal regulation side, but I do want to just touch base on a couple of these agencies. So the U.S. Department of Agriculture, as I mentioned, FSIS is the agency that oversees meat and catfish processing and packaging. The TTB, alcohol producers and manufacturers, will require this federal licensing. But the FDA has a lot of resources and guidelines beyond what is technically a formal licensure or permit, and that's what I wanted to familiarize everybody with. So we had talked about the state, we had talked about the very basic understanding of how to go about asking these questions, what agencies to even be familiar with. At the federal level, there's a lot that trickles down, and so some of these may apply to you. So the Food Safety Modernization Act, also known as FSMA, is a standard that trickles down and really affects the distribution, sales, and tracking of raw agricultural products. So that is products from a scalability standpoint, typically those that are being distributed, but there are standards for the washing, packaging, labeling, and tracking and tracing of raw agricultural products. So if that is part and parcel of your operation, the FSMA standards and the Food Safety Modernization Act is absolutely something to be familiar with if there's a raw agricultural farm side to the business. Dairy. I had said that the Maryland Department of Health regulates dairy and licenses dairy. That is pasteurized milk, that is manufactured cheese, that is made and distributed ice cream. But dairy follows a lot of federal standards. So moisture content for cheeses, federally set, differs by variety of cheese, temperatures, transportation. That's where a lot of the guidelines exist when we're talking about dairy products. The acidified food is recipe dependent, but that might be something you're asked for as soon as you approach the Department of Health for licensure. If you are pursuing an on-farm home processing license or a processing license, thinking about maybe a hot sauce or pickled products, those are pretty common. You may be asked to get your recipe tested. I think it was Luan who just alluded to getting a product tested like the sweet potato pie. There's sometimes an expectation that you would take your recipe, your process, and your product and get it tested by what's known as a processing authority. Very commonly housed within a variety of universities. Cornell and Virginia Tech are two that I often hear a lot about. Penn State, I believe, also has a program as well. You get these products tested per product line, and you get information back that's relevant to what the health department may be concerned about, whether that's pH content, moisture content. And so the acidity level of the product could put you in what is a higher risk type finished product and process. So there is something known as FDA's Better Process Control School class, or the BPCS. That is what I understand to be a one and done course, not offered all that frequently, but there are a number of entities that have offered it in the past. Most recently, I believe the Southern Maryland Ag Development Commission in Maryland had done a couple courses. I don't know if the University of Maryland Extension had done it in the past. I've seen a lot of organizations pop up and offer some of this, but also US or FDA will sometimes post some of these courses as well. Pretty intensive course, but really helps you understand how to handle these high risk products, and allows you to then make these pickles and display that you're certified to handle these acidified foods. Fermentation is also something that may be considered very similarly. The concern about fermentation is the alcohol content control. Again, the reason I had said what I said earlier was you want to be very careful of not being catapulted into the category of an alcoholic product because you're trying to keep your kombucha low, but the process reaches that ABV threshold. And then for cosmetics and the non-food products, FDA's got a lot of guidelines. As I said, there are some allowable ingredients. Tallow is one I've been asked a lot about, and I've learned way more about the use of tallow in cosmetics than I ever thought I'd know in my life. But all of those types of ingredients are included on FDA's websites and FAQ pages. So there's some good guidance on a lot of that, and the do's and don'ts as it relates to labeling. Obviously, there's a threshold to when you stop being a small business in the eyes of the FDA. I don't know exactly what that threshold is, but if we're talking farmers markets and building your brand, there are guidelines to be followed, but not necessarily state licensure. Now, I believe that we just have a few other considerations to run through, but obviously we're here at time. I only talked about the licensure. We know that there's a lot more considerations. Again, aligning with those supporters at the economic or agricultural development offices or the Department of Agriculture, we're happy to offer guidance and connect you with the right folks. It's important to know how you want to label, how you want to package your products. If you're scaling up, how you're going to distribute and store these products. If we're talking about off-site warehousing, know that additional licensure and oversight might come into play. Food service and agritourism, perhaps we'll have to do a whole nother session on that, but that'll probably be several hours because, again, there's a lot more local considerations as it relates to agritourism and how agritourism is treated. Whether or not you want these certifications now, think you might be pursuing them later. That better process control school is few and far between. I believe Shauna just alluded to the fact that the University of Maryland Extension has not offered that, but that there is a list of classes as they're offered at the link that she provided. Thank you, Shauna. So all in all, very complicated stuff. But again, we hope that taking this step back has really kind of helped you at least understand what that framework looks like. We at the Maryland Department of Agriculture have a very similar presentation to this on the Maryland Department of Agriculture website, running through a very, very similar slide deck. I think there was a question about being able to view this later. It's a shortened version of what we talked through today. It's about a 12-minute video, but a very similar slide deck with some interactive links. Here at the end, I just wanted to plug some of these resources. We have compiled a list of the county agricultural specialists. We have a few new ag specialists among us. So this is a few months old, and I promise I'll update it within the month. There is a regulatory decision tree for Maryland producers that was developed by the University of Maryland Ag Law Education Initiative. It's very similar to what we walked through today, but it's more visual in a drop down of, would you qualify for cottage food? Do you need this license? Do you need, are you an acidified food? So a really, really helpful guide as you're pursuing some of these ideas and concepts. Some resources as it relates to the specific Department of Health offices that we mentioned and talked about today. And then, of course, University of Maryland Extension's food safety program and the wonderful staff and representatives that have a lot more information than I do as it relates to the recipe development and all the other considerations and the actual planning for the process, whereas I just covered the regulatory framework this evening. With that, Madison, sorry, I hopefully answered most of the questions through, but I have run us over time.
Thank you, Martin. This was perfect and perfect timing as well. Yeah, this was so wonderful. It's always a learning experience for me as well, listening to you speak. And these slides are excellent. So yeah, with that, I'll say thank you to everybody who is able to join us. And a reminder that Isabel will be sending out an email with this recording and some additional information if you missed anything or you want to go back to look through notes. Thank you, Chelsea. I see you there. And yeah, that reminds me, our next upcoming webinar for November will be about how to access farmers markets going into 2026. So that could be another relatable topic. Chelsea will be our guest speaker for that one. She has a lot of experience. Would you like to say a few words, Chelsea?
Well, I was just going to say, keep an eye out for there is a farmers market list that we are going to be sharing around that has a list of all the farmers markets. So if you haven't caught the blog yet and you're interested in farmers markets, go watch that because it'll really help you figure out what to do to apply. And spoiler alert, applications are starting soon. So a lot of people think it starts in February, but it starts sooner. So that's it. I'll see you there. Thank you guys. And great meeting Madison and Martin. Always such a pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks, Chelsea. Madison, if I can make one plug, I just dropped it in the chat. It was alluded to earlier. So for those unfamiliar, the Maryland Department of Agriculture recently, just 2 weeks ago, published a statewide guidance and analysis document on value-added agriculture and agritourism. Now, this document is a bit more decision maker and regulator facing, but it's a 40-page document that really expands on what we just talked about tonight and goes across value added as a whole with all the ins and outs of how the industry is currently regulated, as well as identifying some major challenges and opportunities. There's already some ongoing efforts to resolve some of these challenges, but you will see if you have the opportunity to read and digest all of this information that we are certainly hoping we're moving in the right direction and supporting you all in the value-added agricultural space that are trying to invest in Maryland, keep farms farming, and really buck this trend. So thank you all.
Thank you for sharing that, Martin. Yeah, we'll include that link in the email that we send out as well, so everyone can access it even after this meeting ends. Yeah, so I hope everyone has a very nice evening. I'm so thankful that you chose to spend this hour with us tonight. But be in touch, please, and we'll see you all soon.